So good morning, live from Fort Myers. So we've got live people, we've got Zoom people. Little rules of the day. If you have questions or comments, for those of you who are on Zoom, please type them in, and then Joanna will repeat it, and we'll try and get you the answers and get some input from those who are attending as well. Those who are attending, just speak on up and jump in. The biggest thing we wanted to talk about, we want to talk about contracts and all your questions, and we want to really make this an interactive workshop. So I've got a few printed things together. I've got a few ideas, but the main idea is find out what's in your head, what issues you're having, questions you might have, because it's better to talk about it and think about it before something happens, instead of you writing up a contract, getting it all signed, and then you call me and go, oh my God. Or I had the contract signed by the seller, 2 different contracts, and then both people got the contract. Now what do we do? That's a big problem. So you want to be very super careful when you have your contracts, especially in this day and age with electronics. It's so easy to hit a button and accidentally send something, and once it's gone, it's like toothpaste. It doesn't go back in, and you can't retrieve it. So, and then you got to call mama, and mama's got to try to fix it. So without any further ado, questions. We've talked about as is. We can talk about vacant land contracts, addendums, anything you want. Tim had a question. Okay, yay! And you can swing it over to Tim if you'd like. Yeah, we can do that. There you go.
Yes.
So a question that comes up a lot on contract.
Okay. Personal property questions. Where do we put it? How do we handle it, etc. And personal property kind of goes in different levels. Because if you look at the contract itself, the as is and the standard, they've expanded out now. So it already includes the range, the dishwasher, the disposal, the ceiling fans, the light fixtures. They've now added the thermostats, the doorbells, the television mounts, and the mounting hardware, the security gate, other access keys, mailbox keys, storm shutters, which weren't in there before. So there's no reason to add to that. If any of those items are not there, come on in. Yeah, so if any of those items aren't included, then what I would suggest would be to strike through that there. If there's no refrigerator, strike through as opposed to them not including the refrigerator that's there. If you don't want the refrigerator that is in the house, then you would put it in E, on 1E. That being said, if there's other things, like maybe there's just there's a microwave or a washer and a dryer, wine cooler, just a few items, I would write them in on line 21. I would do that. The bigger mess that you're talking about, the pit, is when there's furniture, because furniture has value to the seller. It has value to the buyer. To an appraiser, as we've learned through all these appraisal classes, they don't give it too much value at all. And if they're getting a mortgage, the lender doesn't really want to see it on the contract, and I think that's more what you're talking about, because then the lender has to get that over to the appraiser, and the appraiser is going, oh, that's $20,000 worth of furniture, zip $20,000 off the price of the house. Not great to do. And we find that a lot in condos and seasonal properties. They're selling them quote unquote turnkey.
What paragraph are you on?
I'm on paragraph 1D and 1E. That's on as is. It's also the same on the standard. That part stays exactly the same. So what we're talking about is what's printed in the contract, which got changed. So I hate to see the word turnkey, because that's just, there's no real structure, there's no real anything to it. So you want to handle it a couple of different ways. If the seller was smart and the listing agent was really smart, they would have an inventory list already put together, and it would be attached to the MLS. If it's not, I would suggest on additional terms and conditions, if that's either going to be it should be on page 12 of both of your contracts. Then you could write in seller to provide inventory list, within 3 days after effective date. You're not getting into legalese and all of that, and that's pretty straightforward. Other alternatives could be, you could take photos of each property or a video And that I like the idea of still photos only because you can print that and you can have the buyer initial and date it, and then have the seller buyer and initial and date it. And then you can add that as an other. When you're on page 12 where all the addendums are, just click other and then put attached 3 pages or whatever of photos for furniture to convey. Because you'll see that other phrase, owner's stuff, owner's personal stuff. And all of a sudden the Van Gogh became personal stuff. So you want to be really, really careful with that.
Explain that turn phrase that you talked about again a little more.
Okay, I do talk fast. I do.
They are taking
Okay.
copious notes.
Oh, copious notes. Okay. So turnkey, and you'll see that in the MLS, especially on the seasonal rentals. Turnkey really doesn't describe what is being included in the property, because there can be 6 spoons, there could be 5 pieces of dishes, etc. And then you really don't know. There's you open the cabinet and there's 6 sets of sheets. Then you go to do your final walkthrough and there's 3 sets of sheets. So when they say turnkey, they usually are indicating all of those kinds of household items in addition to the furniture. If you see fully furnished, that usually implies just furniture, paintings, etc. Agents can get confused, and so can owners, as to what it means. So try not to use phrases that can be misinterpreted or open to different kinds of interpretation. Be very specific. And make sure when you're on the listing side, the photos that you put in the MLS should be a true representation of what's going to be there, because you might get offers based on those photos. I had to show a house to a friend, my little mitzvah deals that I do, yesterday, and the house said, the listing said tenant occupied. All the photos were of a vacant, beautifully painted, well-carpeted home. Haha. So I called the listing agent and said, which is it? Did the tenant move out, or are they like camping, or what? Oh no, those were photos from before. I don't know what it looks like today because the tenant's in there. But she said, I am getting new pictures this soon, before I said anything else, but make sure that's there. And if you have the buyer, make sure you can get in there and take a look at it as well. Because we've all been through houses where things have gotten swapped out. Mm-hmm.
Not the same. Going.
Yeah, so either a photo or get which is really difficult to do, but you could get the serial number or the model number off of each one and put those kind of things in there. But photos are really good because people will be known to switch out ceiling fans and things like that. And the other thing that we've seen on contracts, you may have seen where they'll go, all furnishings as seen on February 13th. Again, okay, then the seller says, well, you really didn't see it there. You have to have proof. We had one instance where we had the listing, the entire thing was turnkey, fully furnished, had the photos in, got all the way through there. The buyers went to go do the walkthrough and all of the furniture had been exchanged. The seller put comparable furniture, as he said, in, but it wasn't what the buyer saw. Surprise. So another reason you want to do final walkthrough forms. These are not contract forms, but if you're in app files, we've created the final walkthrough form. Janet has now started putting it into your app file. So if you have the listing, send that over to the selling agent and say, please, sign off. That way everybody gets protected, and then we can't get sued for like, oh, the couch was different. Well, you did the walkthrough, you signed off, you had the opportunity. Same thing if you have the buyer, please try to get them to sign it off. Hopefully, if they can't come through for the final walkthrough, they're out of town, I would ask them if they have a friend or a home inspector or somebody other than you, because you want to be really careful that you don't have the liability for it. Worst case scenario, if you do agree to go and do a final walkthrough for them, that's when that lovely little camera video comes in handy. Say, are you there? We're going to walk through the rooms together. You look at it and then tell me it's okay. And then send that form over to them, or get an email, get something that says, okay, thanks for helping out. I accept the property as is. With this environment, with people paying such what they're calling crazy, ridiculous prices for things, they want everything perfect. And they're really getting more litigious, more picky than they ever were. So our job is just to keep that little bubble in the balance, and be calm about everything when we're talking to them. We can scream after we hang up the phone from them.
I have an example.
Were they broken when you made the offer, or were they broken after?
Discovered it after.
Okay.
Found out, discovered.
Sometimes you hit a wall, and that's what,
It was out,
yeah.
and it's fine. Pointing. Loaded in that window.
Disclosures are really something to take a look at when we're starting to talk about the inventory and all of that. Because the wording in the contract, as you are aware, we hope, said the seller has to maintain the property in the same condition that it was in on the day it was written. So if the air conditioning system was working the day you wrote the offer, if the windows were not broken, then they need to stay broken. If they were broken on the day that the contract was there, then you're deemed to have been accepting them unless you write something in. And that's what that additional terms and conditions is for, to do those kinds of little things, which is separate from the inspection. If you see it right there when you go to make the offer, you can put it directly into the contract. Seller to repair, seller to do this. You may also see some things like that about conditions and properties in the MLS where it'll say seller is having the roof replaced, and it will be done before closing. Just because it's in the MLS is not going to make it legal and binding. What's legal and binding is the contract. So whatever comes down onto the contract supersedes everything else. So if it says in the contract seller to have roof replaced, then you put in here, seller agrees to replace roof according to contract, and then I would ask for the contract, or ask for proof prior to closing, and you can put that in writing when you make the offer. That's super important.
If it's not in the purchase agreement, you're just doing the inventory sheet off to the side, that's the same thing if it is on additional terms.
Okay.
So if not on the purchase agreement, is it the inventory sheet? Same thing.
Okay, well, an inventory list can be pages, and there's not really room on additional terms and conditions to put pages. You could reference it on there, again, because it's going to be an additional piece of it. If you're only putting 2 or 3 things, you could do it on additional terms and conditions, but if you're running out of room on the front page. If it starts looking sloppy, then always move to an addendum, because lenders don't read these contracts very well. And if it's all ugly and messy and it's not in the normal place that they can find stuff, they get confused. So we moved everything. So on page 11, you've got all of your addendums now because the contract's been expanded. And they added 3 lines. So now you have room. On the old one, we didn't have anything other than one little other. That's page 11 of the contract. And it does not have inventory list as the more commonly used addendum. So that's where you would put it in as other. When you're talking about personal property, that's a really good thing to put. If you'll notice on the addenda, if you're looking at the addenda, right above other, there's an EE, which is a PACE disclosure. PACE is property like solar heating and things like that, that the owner has a mortgage. Basically, they've got a loan from the government, a PACE loan on the property, and you want to make sure if that water conditioning system is part of a PACE program and things like that. That should be on the MLS. I haven't seen it come up too much in this area. It's been more North Florida, and it's been a real issue because that's like an assessment lien. There's a big lien on that property. Does it have to be paid off and that kind of thing. So if you see that word PACE, stop, call. And we'll discover what we need to do together, because you don't want your customer being responsible for another $20,000 mortgage, or better yet, you having to pay it. So the additional terms is on page 12 of 12, and that's huge. So those are the things you're going to do, the odd little odd little tiny things like seller to contribute $5,000 towards buyers' prepaids, discount points, closing costs, etc. You want to be very big with those words, because if you just put $5,000 towards closing costs, somebody might get stinky and say, well, prepaid insurance is not a closing cost. Discount points that the buyer's getting, that's not closing cost. So be real specific. If you're doing an FHA or a VA loan, when you're talking about contributions, if you don't use a dollar amount and you're doing a percentage, make sure that you say the percentages of what? Is it 5% of the sale price, or is it 5% of the loan amount? You don't have to put that dollar figure in there, but specify where the 5% is coming from. Again, you want to try to be as clear as possible. That's why we're not attorneys and we don't write stuff. That's why they have addendums.
She says she has a doc that she can copy and paste for the seller's contribution.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if you're looking for wording and things like that, we'll see if we can put them into app files. Or yeah, call, ask Joanna, myself. We're always able to help with any of that kind of stuff. If you think it's kind of weird. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yes, and you put that on additional terms. Don't put it on the front of the contract, because then you're making more little red stars, and we don't want the lenders to do that. If it's cash, it's not such a big deal. But how many times are we seeing people writing cash offers now that really aren't cash offers, that they're going to go ahead and they're going to get a mortgage in there? So I would just write this up all the time thinking that they're going to get a mortgage just in case. Because there are people who can afford it, but why pay cash if you can get it for 2.5% or 3%? It's like almost free money,
With the additional terms of lenders and everything, what is the lender's fee in it?
Yeah. If you're going to do it with a lender, then yeah, that's a great question. So what she's asking about, if you have a fully furnished or partially furnished, you're going to do that. When we were talking about assuming there's a lender, don't put it on the contract. Thank you for, and I'll correct myself, Betsy. Thank you for that. Use a blank addendum and keep that separate. Don't check other on there. Just, it's like it doesn't exist on this contract for the lender. Same thing with the photos and all of that. Just keep that kind of separate away from the lender. A bill of sale is a whole nother thing, because the state of Florida likes to collect sales tax on things. Like if you sell a boat, they want you to collect 6.5% sales tax in Lee County. So technically, if you sell the furniture that has a $3,000 value, the state is going to come looking for 6.5% from the seller. So try not to do that. If the buyer and the seller are in contract and then the seller says, oh, I'll sell you some stuff, let the buyer and the seller write their own bill of sale and work that part out. You can be the liaison back and forth. You don't want the buyer and seller to sit down and have coffee and try to negotiate out furniture sales and things together while you're negotiating the contract all up to closing, because they do funky things when they don't have you around. We all know that, and that's what leads to trouble at the end of the day. Yeah. Oh, they do. How about this one? We had fun yesterday. We had a closing and it was sold, furnished, turnkey, etc. The buyers didn't come down for a couple months. They neglected not to have the locks changed after closing. Somebody went in the house and took some things 3 weeks after closing. So, I mean, you can't prove who did it. You don't know who did it. So the only thing is, you can just tell them, well, you can call the police, et cetera, but encourage everybody to change the locks immediately upon closing, or that's a beautiful closing gift. Here's a $50 gift card for, Lowe's or AAA locksmith, something like that. Let them do that. Then there aren't problems. Because when you do that final walkthrough, doing an inventory list can really take a long time. but make sure you do it. It's amazing how people get really emotional about the crock pot that got taken. There, okay.
Yes, I was the listing agent. I'm learning that I should have done an inventory list, but the buyer's agent did a very good job of going around and taking pictures of everything. And on closing day, for the final walkthrough, she said, "Where's the crock pot and where's the ice tray?" And I said, "Well, I'll get you the crock pot." I said, "I'm not getting you ice cube tray."
You can go to Dollar General. And
Freezer. So my seller was still in town. I said, "Have the crock pot." Did take the crock pot back, and then I bought her a new crock pot. I was like, "Is that important?" So I bought her one.
there you go. Yeah, you do whatever you have to do to get those things done. Naples in the neighbor forms in our files, they do have an inventory list. You can use that. I have no problem with that because we're not mixing forms because it's not referencing any particular part of the contract. But that is a really, really, really good point because you've got as is, we have the crispy forms and we have neighbor forms and all of these other forms. Don't mix them because usually there's a reference to a particular paragraph, a particular line, and now you're messing things up and it might not match. And then you can open yourself up to, does it count legally? Does it not count legally? And the less trouble we have, the better. So it always starts with a good, clean contract and just taking your time to think about what you're going to write. You know, deep breath. What do they really want? Scribble on the side. And if it sounds kind of weird, bounce it off another agent that you know, or call us and we'll figure it out. But again, it's better to do it before than after.
I have a question.
Good.
So real example, so houses this, buyers, offer, sellers. Find out that off market section. I don't know. Permit. And the conversation I had with this was, well, it's okay. Structure here, whatever I think exactly tell me why. Whole point is the structure team really wanted to move forward that open permit that was filed. So actually never happened, right?
Okay.
Conversation was about, well, contractor is waiting for the form coming off and
Okay.
we're trying to put an offer in, but all these things happen. My budget or ask you really more. Contractor has permit time public. Big question of
Yeah, that one's a messy one. They've changed and expanded. There is on paragraph 10, the disclosures. There is a disclosure for permit disclosure. They've opened that up. So it says, except as may have been disclosed, seller does not know of any improvements without required permits, like those people who put bathrooms in Lehigh without a permit connected, all that kind of stuff. If seller identifies permits which have not been closed, which is what basically you're talking about, or improvements that weren't permitted, like turning the garage into a house, then they have to deliver to the buyer all plans, written documentation, other information. It doesn't say that they have to close it out. This is it's paragraph 10. On as is, it's page 4. And A is radon gas, B is permits disclosure, covers mold in there, flood zones. The disclosures are really super important. So, because it's not requiring, It's not requiring the seller to close it out. So if you're aware of that when you're writing the offer, that's when you say, okay, seller to close out, things like that. It's going to come up in title. Title's going to find out if there's stuff out there. Right. There, again,
This case, they also not gonna say, closing.
right.
That's what the listing. I recently had the same problem. It wasn't else, but in my research on the listing or going on the market, I saw the permit seller. So we called permitting and they came out right away, but within a week to get it done. So then it wasn't an issue once we went to contract or got on the market. So really the listing agent should have looked at that and taken care of that prior to mine.
Yeah, that's the difference between being a great professional realtor and a bunch of the other now 10,000 realtors in our association. They don't know. And it is, I mean, we rely upon the seller to give us information. We're kind of like the mailman. We deliver the news, but it's also our job to discover things that might lead to questions for the seller. We're not going to make assumptions, but like Ashley was talking about, she did some research and found an open permit when she was getting ready to list the property. So now you go to the seller. Did you know that your permit is still open? What do you want to do about it? If it's open, you got to tell them and not get it done and advise what that does to the value of their property. Or here's how we can fix it now and eliminate any problems for you getting a successful closing, because that's our job. Get it over the finish line and do it right. So it's a lot of research up front. Usually you as a selling agent, you don't need to be going out and doing all that digging. You're going to discover those things are going to be discovered as you start doing inspections and the title company and that. So keep in mind what your job is as a realtor. You don't want to overstep and overlook and discover things, because now a lot of it's going to start coming onto you for liability. I found one thing. Oh, and then the seller said, well, you found that. Why did how did you miss this one? It had Chinese drywall 1,000 years ago and it was never disclosed, but you didn't find that, but you found this. So it slides over. Yeah. So, and that's it. It's all about dialogue and negotiation. The whole thing is always dialogue and negotiation, communicate all the way through to the end of it, and make notes in app files, because you forget the conversations. And if you ever have to defend yourself, we have to defend you. If it's in app files, that's the best place. It's there forever. Redundant servers, everything. Keep it. If there's a fire and you have written notes in your house, they disappear. That's and unfortunately, that's not a defense in a court of law. I lost it. I had a fire. Oh, so bad. Too bad. So sad. The IRS doesn't care if you don't pay your taxes, right? I lost my form. Oh, well. Other questions? Okay. Is it a redundant question? Okay. And we can draft up a little summary of what we're talking about today with turnkey and furnished, so that you can maybe say, okay, here's what a turnkey, here's what semi-furnished, here's what fully furnished is. That might help you when you're explaining to your customer, if you have a little handout. Would that help everybody? Okay. We have great copywriters in our staff, so they'll be glad to help.
They're mostly asking which option you thought was best with the lender, and we've got 3 options: attach an inventory list, use a blank addenda, or have the buyer and seller do it on their own bill of sale. So
okay, well, that will be 4 then. Bill of sale is if it's not being included in the sale price, where they're buying things separately. So that's really not going to be part of the contract. An addendum is going to be where you're going to write out whatever you want to write out. Seller to include the master bedroom furniture, etc. An inventory list is always better for you on something that has pots and pans and spoons and all of that kind of thing. On the buying side, you want to ask the seller to provide it, and that you would write in on the contract. Again, I'm sorry, let me repeat that. And to an addendum, we're only talking about lenders. Put everything on an addendum that relates to personal property, like furniture, personal property. Boats have titles, cars have titles, and a lot of the foreign people were selling their houses, including, they're throwing in the boat. That's when your bill of sale and things starts coming in, because there's taxes on that, there's a title there, and all of that gets conveyed differently. A normal title company is not going to handle the sale of a boat or a car. So those would be things you'd say, let's talk about those completely on the side. That's where you've got bill of sales. So maybe that's answering your question, or is it now muddying it up even more for you? But if,
Got it.
there we go. Okay.
I have another-
Yes.
Okay. I have noticed selling agents requesting offers on the standard. On the standard form versus as is. Standard
Okay.
form potentially. Prior repairs costs.
Okay. Two contracts, as is contracts versus standard contracts. Depending on the side that you're on, it can be beneficial. I personally love the standard contract because it keeps everybody in the game. The seller then has to repair things, and he agrees to that in writing in the contract. 1.5% structural, 1.5% wood destroying organisms. It's written in there, and the contract gets very specific as to what is structural. A pool screen enclosure is structural. A ceiling fan may be structural because that's personal property. So it's going to tell them no on the ceiling fans. But if you've got, what else would be structural? If you've got, like you talked about windows, if windows come with screens, they're going to require them. But the contract is very specific, and it's very specific as to what the seller is going to be responsible for, and very specific as to what the buyer can ask for. You need to know that really well, so that when you're sitting with the seller, they understand it. That's the good part. It keeps everybody in. It doesn't allow the buyer to just say, oh, I don't like the purple paint anymore, I'm out of here. That's the best part of the as is. The as is really is a free look. It gives the buyer a chance to do whatever he wants to do. He can pay for a home inspection. He could do the home inspection himself. And the wording is at the buyer's sole discretion. So during that inspection period on an as-is contract, the buyer can back out for any reason whatsoever. The seller cannot balk at it, can't refuse to sign the release and cancellation. On the standard, there's processes. That does require that the buyer use a professional licensed home inspector. So they have to pay for an inspection. Then they can take that home inspection and go to the seller and correspond with the items that are on the standard contract, like the pool cage enclosure, maybe having torn screens, missing screens. There could be bolts missing. That if both of that affects the structural integrity. So you don't use addendums on a standard contract when you find something that needs to be repaired. You just prepare a list. These are the following items that the buyer is requesting be fixed. And you can reference the paragraph. And I'm sorry I didn't print out the standard with me, but do it that way. And then be prepared to provide documentation to the seller. You don't have to give them the whole entire home inspection unless your buyer says it's okay. Remember, the buyer's paying for it. So the buyer owns it. The buyer can decide how much the seller gets. But if it's just like the pool cage, you can pull out that page with the pool cage if you'd like to do that. Yeah.
A lot of people say that it almost makes sense for a use standard. It keeps everybody in the know, everything else is relook and the rest of them.
Yeah, exactly. I would, as a buyer, and you can explain that to the buyer. It's like it's making the seller stay in the game, and it's making him responsible for fixing things. Because you can go that as is, and the buyer may come back and say, well, the air conditioner is broken, it doesn't work right. And the seller's like, well, too bad, so sad. And then where's the choice? The buyer either walks away or accepts this thing not working. If you've got a standard, then the seller has to fix it, which is good. But it depends on your strategy of what you want to do and whose side you're playing on. I think if you're going to use it and you're going to list the property, we require at Jones & Company Realty that you use the seller's property disclosure statement. We want the sellers to put it in writing. So when you have the sellers complete that, you can say, if you don't live in the house, like you're renting it or something, maybe you should have a home inspection done see what isn't working and all of that, then you can make the decision, do you want to disclose it? Or maybe these items are so small that you could tweak it up, fix it, which will increase the value, and then offer the home inspection to the buyer. Here it is. So that can be a really good way of doing it as well. We're saying we like that better. We like that better, but
She requires the disclosure.
the seller's property disclosure is required. The state of Florida law simply says the sellers have to disclose what they know is wrong with the property. That's not readily apparent. I mean, if an airplane goes over the house all the time, okay, that you can figure that one out. You know, if the property is located next to a garbage dump, okay, you can do that, you know. But if it's built on top of a garbage dump, you know, that you're not gonna know that. Those are things that have to be disclosed.
In the standard contract, are sellers still required to fix things, even if they put 0 on the lines where the contract has 1.5?
Great thing. Now we're talking about standard contracts and what happens. Remember, I said they were legally responsible for up to 1.5%. Well, if you change it to 0, it now became an as-is contract. It just doesn't give the buyer the right to cancel. So that doesn't make sense either. Use the as-is. If way back in the day, before there was an as-is contract, there is an addendum that is an as-is rider. So if you're writing the standard, then all of a sudden the buyer says, oh shoot, you know, I really want an as-is. Rather than rewrite the contract, you can add the as-is rider. And hope the seller reads all of the addendum that go with it. Yeah.
0, and you're just locking the buyer in, and the seller gets everything.
Yeah, and that doesn't help if you're on the buying side. We're transaction brokers, but you want to be as fair and honest with everybody, and that could be misinterpreted. And that's the whole idea, is remember to be fair and honest. We aren't, while we're representing our customer, we are not owing them 110% fiduciary relationship. That would make you a buyer's agent. And that's a whole nother discussion. There is an addendum I wanted to talk about. We don't use it very often, but if you're selling, hi guys, I can see y'all. But if you're selling a lot of vacation properties, you know, if you start out going into Sanibel or things like that, we talked ad nauseum about the furniture and the furnishings, but there's an addendum, double D. And we are not talking bras, we are talking addendums. Double D. It's a seasonal and vacation rentals after closing. So if you're picking up something, if you see, when you're looking, it'll say seller already has this rented, it's part of a vacation rental program, etc. Just because it says it in the MLS doesn't automatically mean that the buyer is going to take it, right? If the buyer doesn't do this rider and the seller doesn't agree, now you get to closing and all of a sudden you've got a bunch of contracts that the seller obligated himself to, but he doesn't own the property anymore. The buyer legally isn't responsible for those contracts. You've got one big ugly mess, and everybody's going to be lawyering up and ponying up and all kinds of uglies. So double D, seasonal and vacation rentals after closing. And I recommend you really read it. So seller may or may not, after effective date and prior to closing, enter into new and renewable seasonal and vacation rentals, because it's ongoing. So you can negotiate whether the seller is going to continue to accept or not when you're doing that. And it says at market rate and terms. And then it goes underneath it. If the buyer can say only with buyer's prior approval. So if the seller is still negotiating, like they've got a contract on VRBO, and something comes in, and you're the buyer, you can say, well, I want to look at each one and accept it because I'm going to be taking the responsibility for it. Or if they're really cool about it, they can say without it and just let the seller rock and roll. You know, it depends on what the buyer wants. Our job is just to discuss the pros and cons of each one and then let them make the decision as to what they want to do. It does require the seller to provide the buyer copies of any agreements. And then that's A. And then B on double D's is if the property has seasonal occupancy agreements in place, which were procured pursuant to the terms of a property management agreement, which we all love, and property management companies sometimes get confused as to who's going to be managing the property after closing. So the seller shall provide all of that. and then they can determine if they want to move forward with that property management agreement. It doesn't automatically transfer to a new owner. I don't care what the property management company puts in their management agreement. They have no legal right to bind somebody else.
Still manage the rentals that they had set up prior to selling.
Only to closing.
Only
After closing, everything belongs to the buyer. So the buyer would have to make new agreements with the companies. So if you've got it, if you've got a maid that cleaning service that's coming in on a regular basis, all new contracts. And that's where you're going to have to help, get all that information, get them in there. And because it is so complicated, that's one reason we don't do vacation rentals. It's a lot because there's a lot of hands-on moving pieces at all the time, day or night. There are companies that do great seasonal rentals, and I would suggest that's what you do with your buyer. Move them off to do that, and then to stay in contact with your customer, because the seasonal rental company is going to be talking to your customer ad nauseum after closing. And if they're like any other realtor, well, now they can go. It's free for all, and they can try to now sell that person more property and push you right out the door. So you want to be really, really careful about staying in contact with your customer after the sale, which is what we were talking about. We've got some videos coming out, and we've got some classes coming out about drip campaigns and things like that. Because not just dripping to get your customers, it's dripping on them afterward. That's the best way of building business, and you get a tremendous amount of referrals, Ashley. I mean, that's the magic of the business. It takes you 3 years to really get it up and running, and then you start getting the referrals. Your past customers, that's your gold mine. That's your database. Work that. I mean, that's why, like I said, I'm doing this little mitzvah. Those are people that I knew like 100 million years ago. Now I'm doing my good deed because I don't compete against you guys. Okay, we have any more stuff coming in? I don't see any more. Okay. Last year we were using kick-out clause. Remember kick-out clauses? I have a feeling they might start showing their little heads up, because sellers are finding some of these buyers are backing out as they go. They said, oh, we write a cash offer, and then they really intended to get financing, and then they get turned down for financing. The sellers had the property off the market for 30 days. So we might suggest to some of our sellers, if we're doing it, or even if our buyers, if they're kind of interested in the house, maybe go into a secondary position, use a kick-out clause. It could be a good thing. Kick-out clause is basically allow the seller to continue to market the property. But yes, I was going to say that our MLS, they do us in, because once it goes under contract, it goes pending in the MLS. Yeah, but if you're you're only going to do that if you're desperate and can't find any properties. Then you're going to start digging a little lower. So if you have that kind of situation, it goes back to marketing for you. That's when you're back on Instagram and Pinterest and social media, even looking to do the cross matching in MLS and keep just sending it back out there. And it's amazing how many deals have fallen apart, and the secondary people are getting the deals. So yeah, something to think about. HUD update. We're still a HUD listing broker. Deb Stack is our listing agent for that, and there's little tiny rumblings that maybe by the end of the year or next year there might be 1 or 2 little foreclosure houses coming up. But overall, the economy is rolling so good. Nobody is really in trouble. Everybody's making their payments. Those who went into forbearance, the majority of people who went into forbearance caught up and paid off. So there really aren't a lot of foreclosures and short sale things going on right now. Good time to take a class. There's a short sale and foreclosure specialist designation, which is like a 1-day class, and I think you can do it online as well. It'd be a good time to learn, it, prepare yourself, because it will eventually happen. And no, it's a Florida Realtors class, and it has CE credit with it. So you get a certification, and you'll get CE credits for it. We love Larson for doing the pre-licensing. We think they're really, really good. After you get your licensing, the GRI courses that we offer at the association help you get your post-licensing for salesmen and brokers. And we tend to be a little bit more loving of that because it's taught by realtors who are in the business and they teach. So, I mean, you have your choices, but Ashley and I serve together in professional development, and we know the difference in what Florida Realtors does. I'm a Florida Realtor instructor, you know, and they put you through the hoops to really be able to teach CE classes. So what you get is really super, super, super good. Yeah. Okay. I'm not. Kickout clause is X. Kickout clause, and I'll read it and then see if it starts to make some sense. Seller will have the right to continue to show the property and solicit, so we can advertise, and enter into bona fide backup purchase contracts with third parties. And Ashley brought up a good point. Our MLS, even though we can show it, MLS requires us to put it pending. You will get caught if you try to go around it. MLS will catch you, and they will fine you. I guarantee it. Whether you're in the Miami MLS, whether you're in the Highlands MLS, whether you're in the Stellar MLS, or whether you're in our Florida Gulf Coast MLS. So don't think you can get away with it. They'll catch you. Okay. So enter into bona fide backup purchase contracts that are subject to the termination of the primary contract. So seller already has a contract to sell at $300,000 to Amy Jones over here. But he doesn't, but Amy has a contingency of the sale of her house, and she's got to get financing and all of this other stuff. But the seller likes Amy and wants a contract. So he'll take that contract, but he'll go back to her and he'll counter back the kickout clause so that he can go and market and look for a better deal. So so upon entering into a backup contract, the seller does have the right. So he gets a contract. Now he's got to tell Amy, right? So the seller will give the buyer a copy of the backup contract with the person's name, any kind of, and the purchase price information obliterated, redacted out. Now, what the printed wording is to continue with the primary contract, that's Amy, buyer number one, right? She must make an additional deposit of blank to really cement her intent to buy with the regular escrow agent within 3 days from the backup contract. If you're on the buyer's side, and you don't want and the buyer doesn't want to put additional monies down, you know, you can strike back through it. And if everybody agrees, initials and dates it, then it holds. We don't want to rewrite this whole thing because the Florida real estate attorneys have already approved it, and we are not attorneys. If the buyers are confused about anything that you're writing, any addendum or whatever, suggest that they have their Florida real estate attorney review it, not their New Jersey real estate attorney, because New Jersey real estate law is different than Florida real estate law. And we've all been down that road. Or I am an attorney. I know what I'm doing. Okay. Remember, the buyer and the sellers are the ones who are the principals. We're the mailmen. I like that one. Okay. When the buyer, and this is in here, okay, within that 3 days, they put that additional deposit down. Now the buyer is waiving all contingencies that they had on that first contract. They are waiving the contingencies of financing, sale of buyers' properties, and they're going to move forward with the closing date. This is something you really have to be very careful about. But it depends on how badly you want that property.
So that
Yes. If they follow the terms of the kickout clause, if they make that additional deposit, they are now a cash transaction.
all the parts,
Well,
and they put 20% down.
this would be a normal reason that something wouldn't close, like not a title problem, not a permit problem, not just a normal thing. This buyer basically says, I'm paying cash, and then the buyer doesn't, something happens. Too bad, so sad. They could potentially lose it. We've seen instances where the sellers have been nice and given buyers back all or some, like if a spouse becomes terminally ill and something like that. Legally, they can be snots. I mean, we had a seller who did that. I mean, the buyer's spouse passed away. And there is and it does say in there that this is legally binding on the heirs and so forth in the contract. But the buyer said, I can't buy it. I can't, they were already past financing qualifications. He was basically in the cash thing. And the seller was a stinker face and went after the full deposit. It's crappy. The part of it is, remember, in the your contract, you live and die by, right? But in the contract, it also says in there that if there is, the money goes back to the seller, the deposit, we are entitled to a commission, and we will share it with the seller. So part of that money comes, can come to the agents, and that's when you can do what you can do. Like both agents on this one, where the seller was such a stinker face and took the deposit, we then decided. Usually the agents don't put a claim on the deposit. Both of us put claim on the deposit, our half of the deposit. We got that half the deposit and gave it back to the buyer. I know. Why a buyer would lose their deposit? Failure to follow the contract. And that's really what I said. You live and die by it. Time is of the essence. Every single obligation that buyers and sellers have has to go by timing. And one thing that we talked about yesterday, we saw a little thing in AppFiles. The agent put contract expired. So we're writing another one. There is no such thing as expiration date in this contract. If you read it, there is not an expiration date. If the buyer screws up or the seller screws up on something like forgetting to make the deposit, not following up with timely stuff, then the contract, someone is in default of the contract. Contract still stays there. And the biggest confusion that everybody really has is, oh, we were supposed to close on February 17th today. Well, so it doesn't close on February 17th. Does that automatically make the contract expired? No, it's still a legal binding contract, but now someone is in default. And then you move into legal things. How are we doing on questions? We're covering all kinds of stuff. If you look at the financing, which I thought was kind of interesting, there's some little changes in there, but they're big changes for us, and they're also for our protection. In the finance paragraph, which is 18 on page 2 of 12 on as is, if you go all the way down to 8.2, it says buyer shall, upon written request, those are new words, keep the seller and the broker fully informed about the status of the buyer's mortgage loan application. It has to be written request. We used to just call up the phone, say, hey, what's going on? They don't have to do it. Legally, nobody's got to do anything. So written request can be considered an email if it's from the right person, but it's the buyer, right? So that's changed. Texting doesn't count for squat. Thank you for saying that. Please, 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 please. Email. If you text or make a phone call, follow up to confirm what you had in the email. You may text something to someone and they might not get it for 5 days, and you don't know because you have no way of getting a receipt that they've read it. And that can open a massive, massive can of worms, especially when you're talking about time is of the essence. If the buyer decides they want to cancel something, I don't want to hear about it in the text, or they call you up, I'm canceling. Fine, put it in writing. Get them to put everything in writing and throw it into AppFiles. That was one of the things I wanted to look at. Also, approval. Okay, we got written notice again on 8.5. If buyer fails to timely deliver written notice to the seller prior to the expiration of the loan approval, then buyer shall proceed forward. How many buyers don't get their mortgage and they just call up the agent and go, oh, I didn't get my mortgage. You know, I'll get you a letter of denial. Well, okay. Get something in writing. If the buyer has the letter of denial from the lender and presents it, that's considered written notice. But it's got to be in writing, and that's one of the biggest changes. We just don't be sloppy. People are litigious and they're going to look for every tiny little detail. They don't read this contract until there's a problem. I can tell you a lot of agents who are new, they don't realize how much little stuff is in there. Yes.
Well, yes, I have had a lot of listings in the last year or so, more so than buyers, that I have seen, especially having multiple offers on every listing, is agents not filling out the contract correctly. And me trying to, in the nicest way possible, say to that agent, this is not correct. And just my latest listing, that's why they didn't win. That buyer didn't win because the agent screwed them. Because the agent filled out the page one of the financing, how much they're putting down, what they have to bring to closing. And I told her, I said, this is not how you fill this out. And she said, this way I've always done it. I'm like, well, you've probably only been doing it a month, but this is not how it adds up. It doesn't add up right. And so she lost it. And it's all because she
Did it wrong.
didn't fill it out right. And of course, I'm going to point out to the seller any red flags I might see in the offer. And another thing that I have seen that has lost deals for buyers is that the agent has attached 20 different addendums. That is very redundant of things that is already in the contract. And found it to be a lot of RE/MAX agents that add all these addendums. And one was the right to inspect. And I'm like, well, this is as is. You already have an inspection. Why do you need this extra addendum? And then I had one that was an appraisal contingency addendum. And I'm like, well, you dang sure don't want that in this market. But so I was like, you just added 5 extra addendums. Half of them are redundant. You have your financing, they were going to have them anyway. Like, you just lost this for your buyer. Didn't fill it out right. Didn't check the right boxes. I'm having to correct your stuff. I don't have time for that when I have 5 other offers that were written perfectly.
Right. You're just going to send it back and say, not acceptable.
Yeah. And if you fill it out correctly, your chances are better. So I feel a lot of agents feels for their buyers more so than just buyer gets have the right offer.
And you're going to come across one angry buyer who will go right after you and say you did your job wrong. And they can potentially sue you, sue Jones and Company Realty. You know, your $5,000 deductible on E&O. Not, you know, it's not something that you want to get into. But you're right. That's what I said. Agents don't read the contract. They don't know what's already in there. And when we talk about being very careful about writing things in, because anything you write in supersedes. It takes, it goes away. Whatever these great attorneys put in here, you write something else, it now changes it. You know, it's like, oh, I don't like this paragraph. We love when those buyers say, let's just strike this whole paragraph out in the contract. You know, be careful. But you're right about not writing things in. And one of my biggest peeves for not writing contracts correctly is right on page 1 in paragraph 2 for the purchase price. That's money. Don't leave any of that blank. I just saw one yesterday. I reviewed it. And they had the purchase price, they had the deposit, and then they had the balance to close down here of like $5,000, and it was like a $350,000 sale price. Okay, where's the rest of the money coming from? Nothing on the front page. Turn the page. Oh, look, financing, conventional more, you know, okay. But you're right. The seller's going to look at that and potentially refuse to even look at it. So now that buyer's agent potentially lost it. You know, and if you don't feel comfortable with it, please just, you know, put it in app files and, you know, ask one of us to review it. Joanna or myself can review it and just tweak it out so you've got the best chance possible of getting your deal done. Oh, a perfect marriage.
Big question was better. So of all of the
I have been very lucky that everything has been for me or appraisal waivers. I have several appraisal waivers. So yes, I do negotiate if it doesn't appraise the buyer.
More language.
Yeah. Things that I've seen that have won the most is someone that comes in with a lot of money down and an escalation clause. That is really what has, by far with my sellers, have what they have liked. Not that we even went up to that amount. It was just the fact that those people had the cash in the funds that they were willing to go up to that amount if needed and would be able to cover that difference.
And use the escalation clause that's already printed if it's all possible. Because again, once we start writing things in, we may be opening ourselves up to misinterpretation and potentially could cost you money, real money. So yeah, use the escalation clause. If it's got to be changed, something, call the broker and we'll work our way through it. That was great. You talked about the financing with the appraisal in there, because that was one of the big changes in this new contract. On page 3, they've got approval on V, which is 6, right? Yeah. Roman. It goes down to line 129, right? So if buyer has timely provided written notice and the buyer fails to close, the deposit shall be paid, blah, 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 unless seller's default, blah, blah. 2, property related conditions of the loan approval. And then it says specifically excluding the appraisal valuation. So you got to watch with that. So if you get denied because it didn't appraise, well, you're not getting, that doesn't count anymore. You've got it.
So.
I've never used money either.
An appraisal, it's basically, if the property doesn't appraise at $300,000, I'm still going to buy it. I'm just waiving,
Well, I meant for me, as far
But-
as appraisal waivers, the lender got the waiver. We never had to do an appraisal.
yeah. And yeah, okay. That kind of waiver. They also have things they call like drive-by. We used to call them drive-bys or desktop appraisals. If a buyer puts enough money down and the bank or the lender is familiar with the neighborhood or the community, they may not require the appraisal to go out and actually physically inspect the property, measure. Yeah, they'll just do a desktop thing. That can be good or bad, depending on what you want to do. Yeah, because you're putting 30-40% down. The banks don't care. They don't care if it appraises. They're just, we're gonna do it.
A question from Zoom. They're asking if after they do more looking into their credit worthiness and the lender decides, hey, you're going to need to put more down. Should they be writing an addendum to change what was on that original contract and the financing and all those numbers?
Okay, question on financing changes to your financing contingency. You write it up, say you're going to write the offer with 10% down. And as you go through the process, the lender says, you know what, your credit sucks, but if you've got another 5% down, we'll do the loan. Different ways you can handle it. The buyer doesn't really have to tell anybody. They can proceed forward within their loan approval time and hopefully get approved for it, or they will get denied with what they wrote. They could go back to the seller. Again, depends on the side you're on, right? You can go back to the seller and try to change the financing contingency. The sellers are going to freak. If all of a sudden the seller said, well, I gave you this great price on this property because you said you could get a loan approval, I got a pre-approval of 90%, loan to value. And now your lender's saying you only qualify for 85% down. They might not be willing to change that. That's a better way to protect your customer if you have the buyer get it changed, but it's very, very, very doubtful. It's kind of that opposite of I'm going to pay cash for it, but I'm really going to get a mortgage. That's happened, yeah, and a lot of people are doing it.
they are changing from FHA to conventional, that they should.
That you can't, yeah, that you cannot get around because they're changing the type of loan. The contract says they're getting a conventional loan. When you're changing the other way around to an FHA or VA, now the seller may be responsible for additional types of monies or types of property improvements and things like that. So it's completely changing it. You have to do that. We're not hiding anything. That you've got to change. If you go from an FHA to a conventional, the seller's going to be doing a happy dance. But any changes like that really should be brought to everybody's attention. You want to disclose things that are important. You don't want to give away information that's going to harm your buyer's privacy issues and things like that. Like all of a sudden the lender says, well, they got divorced 50 years ago, and and they might have to come up with some kind of a statement or something like that. And you're being really nice and big mouthy, and you're talking to the other agent, say, oh yeah, they got divorced 50 years ago and they've got to do this as part of their mortgage. Whoops, not your place. And that's why when you see the loan approval letters from the lender, it's not going to say subject to, divorce decrees and all of this kind of stuff, because they've got to keep everybody's privacy protected. And a lot of stuff about your customers, both your buyers and your sellers. So, remember, as a transaction broker, don't be loosey-goosey with your mouth. Be very, very careful, because you could disclose something that maybe not, they don't want done. People may be planning on getting divorced, but they haven't filed anything. So it's not public record. So unless the parties give you permission to use that word, don't use the divorce word. But you did bring up something really important when you were talking about the person was in early stages of dementia. When you sit down with your sellers or your customers, do determine their mental acuity. Because if they aren't of sound mind, they really don't have they might not have legal capacity to write on this. So you want to be really careful about who's signing for whom, especially if someone maybe is already in early stages of dementia, who's handling the estate, who has the authority to sign for her, and all of those kind of things. And that's when you call in your title companies and attorneys and stuff to review whatever document they hand you, because they could have a form from another state like Maryland, and then they bring it over here to Florida, but it doesn't have the exact wording they want for the power of attorney to ensure it. So earlier the better on that kind of thing. Oh, and by the way, power of attorney does expire at death. We've, you've got power of attorney for someone, and they pass before the contract that he can't sign, and power of attorney does not extend beyond death. So now you're looking at, is it going into probate? Where is it going? Because the contract is still enforceable to its heirs and assigns. It's on page 11, I believe. Yeah, isn't that fun? I mean, we bring these up because we have an elderly population and we deal with a lot of elderly people. So you've got to make sure you've got all those kinds of things available. All right. I think we've filled a whole hour. It does the clock. Yeah, it's working. All right. Yeah. So come in to the class, talk to us. When you're hanging around with other agents, you learn stuff, you share ideas. Zoom is wonderful. We love Zoom, but if it's at all possible for you to come in and hang out with us, it'd be really, really good. Tonight we have the literary club because we get because we get lit. We have a monthly book club that's our social book club. So anybody's invited. We're doing the Great Circle this month. We'll let you know what we're doing next month. It's mostly women. The boys usually go next door to Paradise Pizza and have a beer and wait for us. And we do a little book club, and then we usually go over to Paradise Pizza and have dinner afterwards. So it's a nice little social event. We use the Cape Coral office for that. If you want to start your own book club, or little like a masterminds little group or something like that, use the facilities that we have. We've got this lovely second story up here with our video studio, so you can use that for marketing. And so use the space. That's part of the value of being at Jones & Company Realty. And by the way, we ended up the year at number 15 in residential sales. Woo! Okay. Peace out.